So, Bob, we were filibustering until you made your very dramatic entrance. And I was just posing actually the first question. And what unites this panel is that Madeline, since the beginning of her life in Czechoslovakia, has had to be concerned about Russia. Condi, PhD dissertation, Bob, career Soviet specialist in the Central Intelligence Agency. So they've all lived this issue. And we've seen...
So have you.
And I have as well. And so we've seen now the formal annexation of Crimea. We've seen a deliberate policy to destabilize eastern Ukraine through Russian military support, intelligence support for the separatists so that Ukraine's in the throes of a civil war. We have Russian troops massing today on the borders of that part of eastern Ukraine. And the question to the three of you, maybe Condi will start with you, is this the most acute, serious East-West crisis since the end of the Cold War? And here's the easy part, what should we do about it?
Well, yes, I think it is the most serious East-West crisis since the end of the Cold War, in large part because it's been a long time since a country, a big power in Europe, annexed part of its neighbor. And when great powers start behaving badly, it gets really dangerous. The Malaysian airplane that was shot down because of the sophistication of the equipment. 30,000 feet is a long way up to catch a civilian aircraft. And so when great powers start behaving badly, it gets really dangerous. And we have a great power in Europe behaving badly. Vladimir Putin never accepted the outcome of the end of the Cold War. He has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. That's something when you consider that the Russians lost probably as many as 30 million people in World War II. It's quite a statement to say that was the greatest tragedy. And then he said something that I think is particularly dangerous, and that is that the reason it was a great tragedy is that 25 million Russians were orphaned outside of the Soviet Union in other countries. He means Poland, Ukraine. I remember sitting with him at NATO in 2008 in his last talk to the NATO-Russia Council, and he said something that everybody sort of said, did we hear that right? He said, Ukraine is a made-up state, he said. And I can remember going to see Vladimir Putin, and in one of my last encounters with him, having him say, you know us, Condi. You know that Russia has only been great when it was ruled by strong men, like Alexander the Great, like Alexander II, like Peter the Great. And I remember thinking, and then is Vladimir the Great supposed to be in that line? But I was too polite to ask. I was Secretary of State. And so we have now, I think, a very dangerous perfect storm between a leader who is unreconciled to the post-war, post-Cold War order in Europe, willing to use a combination of economic pressure, military force, intimidation, and surrogates to get his way to try to undo that order, and an international community that seems at times uncertain how to respond. So let me leave it at the analysis of the question, and then perhaps we can get to ways to think about approaching it after Madeline and Bob have spoken.
Madeline.
I do think it is the most serious event since the end of the Cold War, and we all have been diplomats or in the government, and there are many people here with the same background. And there are things that happen all over the world all the time. There are changes, border disputes, various arguments that go on, and that's what people like us used to do for a living. But the bottom line is there have been two huge game changes in the last 6 months, and that is the Russian annexation of Crimea, as Condi said, and the other is what's happened in the Middle East. And in many ways, I think they are related to each other, and maybe we'll get into that. I think that I've been further away from when I met Putin. I didn't like him from the moment I met him. And he didn't like me either. And the bottom line is that I think that he has developed his own version of history. And that is the troublesome part. I think, as Condi said, anybody who can say that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is delusional. And I do think that he has lived his own version of history, and he keeps making it up as it goes along. And I think we depend on the fact that there is a rational actor on the other side of the table. And so I'm kind of worried about his own approach to issues. And it does lead to the question of how we deal with it, because I think what he has done is identify himself with a very this really sounds like psychobabble problem that Russia has been having. You were there, one of the things that we were asked to do, so were you, Bob, is basically how to devolve the power of our major adversary at the end of the Cold War without doing it in the field of battle. And it's true, I happen to think they lost the Cold War rather than we won it, because the system didn't work. And so we, in the 90s, all of us in some form or another, were working to try to figure out how Russia could be brought into the system and could be a normal country, and we could operate in a functional international system. I went and I was doing survey work at the time in '91, and I'll never forget this. I was in Russia with a focus group, and this man stood up and he said, I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles. And that loss of identity is something that is a motivating factor in Russia. And what has happened is Putin has identified himself with that, Vladimir the Great. I really do think he has, which somewhat I think accounts for his popularity at the moment. And so I think we have to deal with what has been happening in Russia since the end of the Cold War, what the relationship is with the United States, the identity crisis, and a leader who has made up history.
Bob.
I think that, first of all, I agree in terms of the magnitude of the crisis. I also agree that it has its roots in what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think in the early 90s, we did not fully appreciate the magnitude of the humiliation that the Russians felt, and with the collapse, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the centuries-old Russian Empire. And I think one of the reasons we face a serious crisis and why it's the worst since the end of the Cold War is that Putin is really trying to upend two aspects of that, 2 points of international order that people thought were settled. The one was that border changes could only be resolved through peaceful negotiations and the consent of the parties, and not the satisfaction of revanchist claims by force. The second was the freedom of sovereign states to choose which other countries with whom they wanted to ally politically, economically, and for security. Both of those Putin has essentially thrown aside. And so what the Europeans and we for a long time felt was a matter settled at the end of the Cold War is now very much back up on the table. I think Putin has two goals. I don't know that he's delusional. Maybe because we both came from the spy business, he and I had a very interesting relationship. We didn't like each other, but there was a certain interesting respect or suspicion, I'm not sure which. But we would speak very frankly to one another, and partly because I wasn't a diplomat, and neither was he. But I think he has, after two things, and one is what Condi alluded to or talked about, and that is this sense of historical mission to protect the Russians who were left behind after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the second is more traditional Russian behavior, and that is the creation or recreation of a band of states on the periphery of Russia that lean toward Moscow economically, politically, and for security. He doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union, I don't think. He doesn't want to be responsible for all those economic basket cases on the periphery. But he does want to recreate this buffer, if you will, that has been very much a part of Russian history for a long time. And frankly, I think he sees Ukraine as the linchpin of that. Kiev was where the Russian Empire was founded over 1,000 years ago. I think he does see it as a made-up state. And I think that he will never rest easy as long as he thinks that Ukraine might slide west and away from Russia and not a part of that buffer of states on the periphery of Russia.
So let's get to policy. What should the United States do? We're going to hear tomorrow from Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, who's really been at the center of this. But as I appreciate what President Obama has tried to do, and he's worked very hard on this, sanction Russia to drive up the costs of the behavior in Ukraine. He didn't have much help from the Europeans until just 2 weeks ago when the Europeans finally joined the United States and Canada in tough sanctions. First. Second, try to help the Ukrainian state, which is a basket case of its own economically, high levels of corruption, to unite, to raise its economic performance, and to try to pull together an effective military. And third, try to reinforce NATO so that the frontline states of NATO, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, are protected, and there's a deterrence there. Is that the right strategy? Should all that be reinforced, Condi?
I have no problem with the 3 pillars.